Looking at our world from a theological perspective. This is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Have you ever been frustrated? Have you ever been really, really frustrated? I mean, come on. I mean, really frustrated. No, not your little pretend frustrated. I mean, real frustration, like an overwhelming sense of frustration. You can be honest. Hey, look, no one is looking. You can be, okay, I see that hand. I see that hand. Okay. Oh, I see. Now, see, when you don't think anyone's looking, everyone's like, yeah, I've been frustrated a lot. In fact, I'm very frustrated at this very moment. Hey, I feel you. I hear you. Okay. But we'll talk about frustration. But before we do that, I'll get extremely frustrated if I don't give a proper introduction. And I don't want to add any frustration to my frustration. So let's do this. Good afternoon, everyone. It is Saturday, July the 6th, 2024. It is currently 3:42 p.m. Central Time, and I am coming to you live from the Theology Central studio, located right here in Abilene, Texas. Now, if you have a notebook, I want you to open that notebook. I don't really care what you write with today. Typically, I would say it has to be in pencil. I don't care. You can use crayon. You can use a marker, Sharpie. I don't care what you use. You can use whatever you want. Just write in the notebook. I want you to write down. The number, not just the number one. I want you to write down a number of things that frustrate you in your Christian life. I want you to write down maybe the top 5 things. I want you to write down a number of things that bring great frustration into your Christian life. That as a Christian, that these are frustrations that are specifically, they frustrate your Christian life. They frustrate you as a Christian. That they're very much related to your Christian life, your spiritual walk. What are the things that bring great frustration to your spiritual walk? What are some of those things? What frustrates you the most? Come on, be honest. Look, some of you may not even want to write this one down, but I think if we're honest, sometimes you know what frustrates me about the Christian life? God himself can be frustrating, can he not? Here's God, all-powerful, omnipresent, all-knowing. Well, I think you would want God to use that power and that knowledge and that presence, I don't know, to fix a whole lot of things. I mean, do you ever feel that way? I mean, if God is all powerful, he can remove our sinful nature. Therefore, we could all just be perfect and holy. I mean, here's the thing, an all powerful, all knowing, all present God. I don't know. How about you just fix the church where we could all, agree on something? I mean, could there just be like one thing Christianity could agree on? I mean, sometimes I get a little frustrated with God. Oh, come on. Don't act all spiritual. You have to have frustrations with God sometimes, right? Never? Okay, well, I guess you're more spiritual than me. If I'm going to be honest I've been frustrated with God many times in my Christian life. I get very frustrated about Christianity itself, especially when it comes to this. So I'll try to make it more specific because just saying Christianity itself, that's kind of vague. I get very frustrated that Christians can't agree on anything. 2,000 years of church history. Do we agree on baptism? No. Do we agree on the Lord's Supper? No. Do we agree even on the definition of the word repentance? No. Do we agree on salvation? No. Some people say, yes, we do. No, we don't. We got everything from Pelagianism, semi-Pelagianism, to Arminianism, to Calvinism, to Augustinianism. I mean, just on and on and on. No agreement on. No agreement on eschatology. No agreement on ecclesiology. Literally no agreement on anything. Take any verse of the Bible and go to 15 Christians, you'll get 47 different interpretations. We don't even agree on which hermeneutical system is correct. We don't agree on how to interpret the Bible. We don't even agree on the system we should use to bring about an interpretation. We don't agree on anything. Does that not frustrate you as a Christian? Oh, it frustrates me to no end. You know what else frustrates me in the Christian life? Me. Are you not frustrated at yourself for being a Christian? Because sometimes self can be so frustrating because on one hand, don't you want to serve God and glorify Him and live for Him and please Him? On the other side, don't you want to sometimes glorify you and live for you and please you? Is that not frustrating? There's so many things, but I want you to identify. I don't know how many will actually participate, but identify those things that greatly frustrate you in your Christian life. Be very honest about it. Now, you may be asking, well, why? Why are you talking about what is frustrating? Why are you talking about frustration? Why do you sound so frustrated? Well, many of you know that a couple of weeks ago, for our Sermons 2.0 app sermon challenge, remember I told everyone starting at the beginning of the year, really the end of last year, download the Sermons 2.0 app every single day, choose a random sermon, listen to the sermon, write down the name of the broadcaster, and then write down a summary of the sermon. The goal is by the end of the year, you have one sermon for every day of the year. And then some weeks I'm giving you specific themes to look up or sermons on specific topics, et cetera, et cetera. Well, a couple of weeks ago, because I'm participating in the same challenge, I was going to have to be driving around. So what did I do? I grabbed my iPad and I downloaded some sermons. And I ended up choosing a random sermon called The Coming Middle East War. Now, I thought that was great, right? The Coming Middle East War. We've been doing a series on eschatology. This may fit in. I can add this to supplement our series on eschatology. This should be interesting. And then I clicked on the sermon and saw the full title, Psalm 83, The Coming Middle East War. And I'm like, wait, what in the world? How do you get Psalm 83 to a coming Middle East war? And then it just started getting more and more frustrating, right? Listening to that series, I think there's now 25 parts to that original series that sparked all of this. And about 24 of them, I don't think has anything to do with Psalm 83. It's maddening beyond all comprehension. It was crazy. Then it got really frustrating because we listened to some sermons that said, no, Psalm 83, that's 2 Chronicles 20. And I think they said King Jehoshaphat calls in Asaph, the author of Psalm 83, to write this lament. And then we come to find out that's impossible. Asaph was dead way before the reign of that king. What are you talking about? More frustration. And then it was just like all the different things people do with Psalm 83 was maddening. And then more maddening. And then more maddening. So what I thought would be like an easy, hey, this will be an easy series, it has turned into now hour after hour after hour after hour of work on Psalm 83. Well, I'm here in the studio working on Psalm 83 for tomorrow at Victory Baptist Church. Now, I find out there's going to be visitors and there's going to be a lot of things going on. More people are going to be there than normal. And a lot of these people haven't been there for any of the Psalm 83 thing. And I'm like, okay, so now what do I do? How much do I review? What do I do? Okay, what do I do? I'm going to have to use the first hour and the second hour for Psalm 83. All right, so what do I cover in the first hour? What do I cover in the second hour? How much do I review? How much do I review in the first and second hour when the people in the second hour won't be the same people there in the first hour? Oh, what do I do? And as part of me is like, I just want to just give up and say, you know what, we're done. We finished Psalm 83. I know you didn't realize it, but we finished it. But I know I can't. And it's just like frustration, frustration, frustration. What do I do? So I was just sitting here and I kind of was like, just like, okay, I think I've done. I don't know what else I can do. If I add any more things to my notes, we're going to finish Psalm 83 when I'm 152 years old. We've got to finish this thing at some point. Stop adding things to your notes, right? I'm just like slapping myself in the face. Stop, just give up. You're finished. You're done. This is a train wreck. You've messed it all up. Okay. So I'm sitting and then I look down and sitting to my left, you know what that is, ladies and gentlemen. Come on. Some of you who never listen to the broadcast, you're like, it's paper. Okay, no. Okay. But some of you know exactly what newspaper I have in my hands. I have an issue of the Sword of the Lord newspaper. And we've been, I told you last year, everyone should get a subscription to the Sword of the Lord newspaper. Even though I don't always agree with everything in it, I always find some kind of spiritual food in it. So I was sitting here. Now, this issue is the June 7th, 2024 issue of the Sword of the Lord newspaper, which we've been utilizing as we've talked about revival, as we've started a series on revival, which that's getting a little frustrating. But to be honest, the last episode went much better than I thought. But I just had it sitting here. And so I'm just like, I kind of got my, my hands down in my, my face and my hands just kind of sitting here going, woe is me. Psalm 83 is going to be trash. Psalm 83 is garbage. I'm going to delete the entire series. I'm going to delete my entire podcast. I'm going to become an alcoholic. Okay, all right, maybe that's a little bit of hyperbole. But I just like, oh! So then I look down, and then the very first word I see in the Sword of the Lord newspaper is the word frustrate. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Come on now. Who's messing with me? I'm frustrated. And the first word I see when I look at the Sword of the Lord newspaper is the word frustrate. Come on now. Who's messing with me? I'm looking around. Come on. I'm being pranked, right? Come on. So who's punking me here? Come on. Who's doing this? So then I thought, you know what? Since I don't know what to do with Psalm 83, let's take this concept of frustrate. Let's take this concept of frustration. Let's see what we can do with it. So let's start with some basic definitions. Frustrate. To balk or defeat in an endeavor. Frustrated her opponents by her ball handling. So you can frustrate other people by basically stopping their endeavor, by, balking at it. You're doing something to frustrate their attempts to do something. You frustrate it. Sometimes in the Christian life, you know what? Who can be the most frustrating thing in your Christian life? Are other Christians. They can frustrate your endeavor. They can frustrate your attempts. They can, in a sense, they can walk around with a bucket of ice water to pour out on anything you want to do. Sometimes Christians are the most frustrating part of the Christian life. Another definition. So there's to balk or defeat in an endeavor, right? An endeavor. Next, to induce feelings of discouragement. Oh, all you have to do is be a pastor or be a Christian broadcaster and let the Christians do their work, their best work. Their very best work is frustrate, to discourage, to beat you down. Right? I mean, rarely are Christians a source of encouragement. They frustrate. Sometimes what you just want to do is like, I just want to respond to some emails. Well, you need to step up your game a little bit. I know you're going for frustration, but you're not quite there yet. You go back to the drawing table. You come back. You can do much better. I got 3 emails before yours that is so much better and frustrating. And discouragement. You're kind of just playing at the game, all right? And sometimes I want to tell church members, okay, I know you're trying. I know it's Monday. Maybe you should just start calling me a Sunday night at midnight to frustrate because you're really not putting forth enough. I'm really disappointed in your game. You should be able to step it up, but be a little bit more frustrating, be a little bit more discouraging, all right? So to frustrate is to induce feelings of discouragement. So in a sense, what is it in the Christian life that leads to feelings of discouragement? Next is to make ineffectual bring to nothing. Illness frustrated his plans for college. That's the idea of frustrated or frustrating. Now, the idea is sometimes you're trying to do something and you are frustrated. So for me, for the Psalm 83, I'm just frustrated. I'm frustrated at all the nonsense of all the different interpretations of Psalm 83 that literally make no sense. I'm frustrated that now I'm so far into this, there's no way out. I gotta bring this to some kind of conclusion, and I don't even know, am I even accomplishing anything? So there's that frustration. But what was the Sword of the Lord talking about when they talked about frustrate or frustration? Well, I picked up the paper after I saw the word frustrate, and I read this. Are you ready? Quote, I do not frustrate the grace of God, For if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. Galatians 2:21. I do not frustrate the grace of God. I do not frustrate the grace of God. Now, this is Paul affirming that he does not frustrate the grace of God. So then immediately I stopped, didn't even read anything else. I folded the paper over so I would not see anymore, and I set it down. And then I said to myself, Self, how do you frustrate the grace of God? Do you frustrate the grace of God? And I said to self, or myself said back to me, myself did not answer myself. Myself basically said, that's an interesting question and would probably make for a great podcast episode. So what you should probably do is take all of your frustration, go live on the air, ask everyone what frustrates them in the Christian life, and then ask everyone this very profound question. Do you, I'm not speaking to me now, I'm speaking to you. Do you frustrate the grace of God? Do you frustrate the grace of God? What does it mean to frustrate the grace of God? Well, obviously we know the New Testament. If we're going to try to understand that word frustrate, well, let's probably need to look it up and see how it's used in the interlinear. What is the Greek word, right? Don't you think that's probably a good idea? So, well, I think it's a great idea, okay? Even if you think it's a bad idea, I think it's a great idea. So we're going to go to the Blue Letter Bible app. I'm going to go to the interlinear, okay? I'm going to pull up the text, Galatians 2:21. I do not frustrate the grace of God. Paul doesn't frustrate, but do you and do I frustrate the grace of God? So I clicked on the verse, or tapped on the verse. There's the interlinear. I tap on interlinear, and then here it is. It's the Greek word basically is translated, the one Greek word is translated, I do. It's interesting. I do frustrate is how it would all put together, but then you have to put the other Greek word, and then you get not. Okay, so yeah, we could break it all down and how it would look, but here is the Greek word. Are you ready? Here is the Greek word. Here we go.
Strong's G114, atheteo. Atheteo.
Atheteo. Atheteo. Do you atheteo the grace of God? Do you atheteo the grace of God? I need you to really contemplate that today, right? On this afternoon, a day of maybe you're not frustrated. Maybe you are frustrated. Maybe you get frustrated by many things in your Christian life. But do you, forget about those things that frustrate you. Do you atheteo the grace of God? Do you frustrate the grace of God? I know it's easy for us to think of all the things that frustrate me. And my list is long, all right? It is long, but do I frustrate the grace of God? Well, the word is used 16 times. 8 times it is translated despise. That's interesting. Do you despise the grace of God? Oh, now this may get a little bit more uncomfortable, right? 4, reject. Do you reject the grace of God? Do you despise? Do you reject? Bring to nothing. Now that kind of goes back to the English definition. Remember the English definition, if I could find it, the English definition, to make ineffectual, bring to nothing. Do you make the grace of God ineffectual, or do you bring the grace of God to basically be nothing? Oh, that would be a bad thing. All right. So let's go back to the interlinear. Do we atheteo the grace of God? Do we despise it? Do we reject it? Do we bring it to nothing? Do we frustrate, disannul, cast off? Strong's definition, okay? And there's a whole lot of interesting here. To set aside, to disesteem, to neutralize, to violate, cast off, despise, frustrate, bring to naught, to reject. Do you do these things to the grace of God? Now, I know what you're going to say. No, 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 no. I never do this to the grace of God. I love the grace of God. I rejoice in the grace of God. But is there parts of us that despise, reject, bring to nothing, frustrate, disannul, cast off, reject? The outline of biblical usage: to do away with, to set aside, to disregard. In what ways in your Christian life are you doing away with? You're setting aside, you're disregarding the grace of God. Now, as soon as you start talking about the grace of God, the grace of God, the grace of God, the grace of God, sooner or later, someone's going to say, well, I understand God's grace and I understand God's unmerited favor. I know God doing that we do not earn or we do not deserve. But almost inevitably, you're going to hear some preacher or some Christian say, but, there may be grace, but, and then they'll start saying, there's got to be these other things. Now, the minute they say, but, they've just completely rejected, completely just thrown out everything that comes before, which is the grace of God. To do away with, to set aside, to disregard, to thwart the efficacy, to nullify, to make void, to frustrate. Do we thwart the efficiency, the efficacy, the effects of God's grace? Let me put it that way. Do we reject? Do we refuse to slight? Those are all some of the outlines of biblical usage. What do we do with the grace of God? Now, Paul's obviously writing to the church at Galatia. And again, he says, now Paul's telling them, I do not frustrate the grace of God. For if righteousness comes by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. Now, clearly, he's seemingly to imply, I don't frustrate the grace of God. But I think there may be an implication that they do, are in danger of, or are doing it currently. Now, the article says this: frustrate means to put aside. So Paul said, I do not put aside the grace of God to teach salvation by keeping the law by human righteousness. So Paul is saying, hey guys, I do not set aside the law of God when teaching. I do not set aside the grace of God when teaching salvation. Therefore, because I would be setting aside the grace of God if I taught salvation had anything to do with what you do and keeping the law. Remember, we cannot keep the law. We cannot keep the law before we're saved. We do not keep the law after we save. We're in violation of the law perpetually in some way, shape, or form, because the law demands a perfection internally, externally. If you violate one point of the law, you're guilty of all of it. We're always guilty of the law. So if you set aside the grace of God to teach salvation and connect it to anything related to the law, well, nobody's going to be saved. It's only going to bring condemnation, but you're setting aside the grace of God. Paul's like, I do not do that. So let me read again how the Sword of the Lord paper puts it. Frustrate here means to put aside. Paul said, I do not put aside the grace of God to teach salvation by keeping the law by human righteousness. The paper adds a little bit more. The Galatian Christians fell into this sin, and so do many other Christian people and preachers. Now, what sin? The sin of frustrating the grace of God. The sin of rejecting the grace of God. The sin of bringing the grace of God to naught. The sin of setting it aside. How do you do that with the grace of God in your life? Or how do you do that when it comes to other people? Now, this is the Sword of the Lord newspaper. I quote, they frustrate the grace of God, or put aside the grace of God, and pervert the plan of salvation by having people either, number one, work to get saved, number two, work to keep saved, or number three, work to prove they are saved. Uh-oh. That just got serious, and that just will offend all kinds of people. Let me read that to you again. The article says that many people, many Christians and many pastors and many churches, they frustrate the grace of God or put aside the grace of God and pervert the plan of salvation by doing one of three things. Are you ready? Number one, they tell people they have to work to get saved. Number two, they say you have to work to keep saved. Or number three, you have to work to prove you are saved. Now, some people can say, but works prove you're saved. Works prove you're saved. The works of Christ proves I'm saved. Whatever you say, well, you have to do this, or you have to do this, you have to do this in order to prove that you're saved. And I'm going to say Christ did it for me. Because if I look to my life, I'm never going to do those things perfectly or even come close. So then you get graded on a curve. It all falls apart. You will ultimately frustrate the grace of God. You're setting it aside. You're taking the grace of God, casting it aside to turn to some kind of law-based, works-based system. The Christians at Galatia had been led astray by those who taught them that they must keep the ceremonial law or they would not be saved. Thus, they frustrated the grace of God. Paul said to them who were depending on salvation by works, you are fallen from grace. That is, they have fallen from the biblical doctrine and the biblical truth of salvation by grace, and going away to that ancient carnal heresy of getting saved by good works. We like to put ourselves in it somehow to get some kind of credit. Something that we do. Now typically we're very good at not saying we do it in order to be saved, but we do it because we save. Therefore, I prove that I'm saved by what I do. So it still becomes about you. And then if you don't do it, well, then you're not saved, meaning you have to do it in order to be saved. You're just playing a game of semantics. You're still making works essential to salvation. Work is essential to salvation. The work of Christ, which then is imputed to me. How do you set aside and frustrate the grace of God in your own life? And how do you do that when it comes to other people? So then I set aside all of my other frustration. I'm like, well, let me do a little work here. Let me do a little work here on this subject. So I started trying to put some things together from some different sources. Here's one source. Paul's statement in Galatians 2:21, and then they quote it this way, I do not nullify the grace of God, is a powerful declaration of his understanding of the central role of grace in salvation. I think it is a powerful statement, and I do believe that it is Paul emphasizing the central role of grace in salvation. Paul emphasizes that salvation is by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, not by the works of the law. He asserts that if righteousness could be gained through the law, then Christ died for nothing. His death is in vain. This verse, Galatians 2:21, underscores the foundational importance of God's grace in the life of a believer. Let's do a little bit more on Galatians 2:21. Paul is contrasting in Galatians 2:21 the concept of grace with the idea of trying to earn salvation through the adherence to the Mosaic law or any form of self-righteous works. He firmly believes that salvation is a gift of God's grace, freely given, and not something that can be earned by human effort. And because we are saved by God's grace, we are saved by an imputed righteousness, which you cannot do anything to demonstrate or prove you have it because it's imputed. It doesn't do anything to you practically, but it does everything for you positionally. By Paul stating that he does not frustrate the grace of God, Paul affirms the sufficiency of Christ's sacrificial death on the cross for the forgiveness of sins. He recognizes that if the righteousness could be attained through the law, then Christ's death would have been in vain. So in a sense, if you're frustrating the grace of God, you're denying the sufficiency of Christ. At the same time, when Paul says, I do not frustrate the grace of God, I do not set it aside, I do not nullify it, Paul basically is declaring that he does not frustrate the grace of God. He's expressing his reliance on God's unmerited favor and love. He encourages believers to trust in God's grace for salvation and to not add unnecessary burdens of legalistic requirements. He's embracing that salvation is by the unmerited favor of God. Paul's statement also serves as a warning against falling into legalistic tendencies, where individuals might think that they can achieve salvation by following a set of rules or rituals. The legalistic mindset frustrates the free gift of grace that God offers through Jesus Christ. Now, the way many churches do so is they don't say you do it to get it, but you got to do this. And if you don't do this, 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 then you were never saved. Making then it all about you and what you do. Now, everything you tell me I must do to be saved, Christ did for me. By faith, his righteousness is imputed to my account. So I do all of those things. So back off. But how do we frustrate the grace of God in our own life? How might we frustrate the grace of God? Well, I think one could be legalism, right? By adopting a legalistic mindset that seeks to earn salvation through adherence to rules, rituals, or self-righteous acts, we can frustrate the grace of God. I think we can become legalistic and say, well, I got to do this, or do this, or I do this, or I do this, or I do this. Therefore, I'm proving I'm saved. When you start looking at the list of rules and things you do to prove anything, people say, well, I'm not saying you have to do it to be saved. I'm saying you have to do it to prove that you're saved. I've said this a million times, and I'll continue to say it. That's just saying the same thing, because if I don't do it, then I'm not saved. So not only do I have to do it to prove that I'm saved, I have to do it in order to be saved, because I have to do it to prove that I'm saved. Therefore, it's a requirement. Now, whatever requirement you give me, if I'm frustrating the grace of God, if I'm looking to myself as the one who's doing it, I look to Christ that he's already done it on my behalf. So any legalism frustrates the grace of God. How about self-reliance? When you rely on your own efforts, your own achievements, your own merits for salvation, instead of acknowledging our complete dependence on God's grace, you're frustrating his grace. Are you frustrating the grace of God today? How do we frustrate the grace of God? When we lack humility. You see, pride and self-sufficiency can hinder us from fully embracing and experiencing the grace of God, as they prevent us from recognizing our need for his mercy. When you can't just acknowledge how messed up you are, when you can't just acknowledge how totally sinful we still are. So much of Christianity, everybody wants to pretend to be godly and to be better than everyone else. And we always refer to those people, them, they, all those bad people, but we are so good. You're out of your mind. You're frustrating the grace of God because you're looking to yourself and pretending to be better than you are. Humility will acknowledge your own failure, your own weakness, your own sin, and you'll be like, man, I can't frustrate the grace of God. I am in desperate need of the grace of God. Now, do we frustrate the grace of God if we fail to forgive? I'm going to put that as a hypothetical. If we hold on to grudges and resentments and unforgiveness towards others, does that not hinder us from fully receiving and extending the grace of God in our lives? Now, I don't think it hinders us, because I receive God's grace by faith alone, and God is the one who gives me the faith. So I receive it. I think what I'm doing is I'm frustrating God's grace because I'm not extending it to someone else. I'm frustrating God's grace from being extended to someone else. I think in that sense, right? And if I'm so forgiven, should I not be that forgiving? So that does that frustrate God's grace in my life to some level? There's something frustrating going on when those who've been forgiven of so much will not forgive others. And what we tend to be very vengeful. We want revenge. We want to destroy. We want to shame. We want to humiliate because I didn't get it my way. It didn't go my way. So now I take down. There's something. Now, there's some ways I think that's frustrating. Now, what happens if, as a believer, we neglect, say, prayer, reading the Bible? We're not really pursuing a relationship with God. Is that frustrating the grace of God? So I don't know. I don't know if that is really frustrating the grace of God. I think that's demonstrating a lack of maybe gratefulness. You know, if we're grateful for what God did for us, then we would pursue everything that would draw us closer to God, right? How about if we refuse to acknowledge and change our mind about sin, and we refuse to try to pursue godliness versus sin? If we don't struggle with sin, are we frustrating the grace of God? Are we nullifying the grace of God? Are we setting aside? I think the issue is not so much if we turn from sin. I think the issue is if we don't admit our sin. See, I'm frustrating the grace of God because if I don't acknowledge it's a sin, then I'm basically saying I don't need God's grace here, and I'm holding on to the fact that it's not as sinful or that I'm better than I am, when in reality, if I will just acknowledge how sinful it is, I think it's not. I don't think we frustrate the grace of God if we don't necessarily stop the sin, because we frustrate God's grace when we don't acknowledge that it is a sin, and we don't come to God with it. I think that is, in a sense, how we frustrate the grace of God. So Galatians 2:21. Paul writes these words: I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. Now I'm going to throw out an idea here. Now remember, whenever I do these messages, I like to leave it a lot in your hands to see what you can do with it, right? That's why maybe perpetually my podcast leads to frustration, because I really leave every episode with not a closed circle, because you're the one who's supposed to come along and say, okay, I worked on this and this was my conclusion. I leave you a major part of it. I'm hoping you're doing that part of it. I just never know about it. So I never know then, okay, what it accomplished. But I'm just going to throw this out there. Just read that verse again. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. I will argue that modern day evangelical fundamentalism is in a perpetual state of frustrating God's grace, because it typically seeks or it promotes a system of obtaining righteousness through law keeping. They connect righteousness with doing right. They connect righteousness with obeying the law, but we cannot obtain righteousness through the keeping of the law. Why? Because we never will keep it enough to ever be righteous. Remember, just think the way you can take all the laws of God and say, well, I'm keeping this and keeping this. It doesn't matter. If you break one, you're guilty of all of them. You're in a perpetual state of unrighteousness. I know this goes against every every modern day Christian thinking. If you go back to the Reformation, this is really the heart of the Reformation, right? Remember the argument versus imputed versus infused righteousness. Modern evangelicalism has created a system that righteousness is obtained by law keeping. Keep the law, be righteous by obeying the law. Everything about be holy, be righteous. It's all about do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this. And then everyone thinks, well, I don't do this and I do this, so I'm righteous. I thank you, Lord, that I'm not like all these other people who are extortioners, adulterers, fornicators. Lord, I tithe. I do this. I go to church. I don't watch porn. I don't watch rated R movies. I don't wear immodest clothing. I do this and I do this and I do this. And that's evangelicalism and fundamentalism in a nutshell. It's about righteousness obtained by the law. That frustrates the grace of God. Because that is obtaining a self-righteousness. A righteousness before God, you can keep and 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 keep, and you're still unrighteous. I know nobody wants to acknowledge that. I know nobody wants to admit that, but look at the standard. Love God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, with all of your body. You're not even going to come close to that, right? Because you have a sinful nature. So not all of you is ever going to love God. You're in a perpetual state of sin. Love your neighbor as yourself. Give me a break. Okay, you love yourself so much. That's all you think about. That's what motivates almost everything you do. In fact, your love for self is what motivates your love for others. Because you love others because they love you. And when they stop loving you, the way then you want them destroyed and you want to humiliate and kill. All right. Okay. Maybe not physically kill, but you get the idea because it's all about you. Be ye holy as he is holy. That means perfection. You're never going to do that, no matter how many things you do. If righteousness could be obtained by law keeping, then Christ's death is in vain. He didn't need to die. Why did he need to die? Because we can never be righteous in law keeping. The law was never designed to make us righteous. The law was designed to show us our unrighteousness. So what do we need? We need not to frustrate the grace of God. I come and realize only by grace, faith, Christ. By grace and faith, I put my faith in Christ, and then his righteousness is imputed to my account, and nobody can see that. It cannot be perceived. It cannot be tested. It cannot be challenged because it's obtained by faith alone. Let me read the verse again. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. Righteousness does not come through law keeping. Get so tired of Christians thinking, well, no, if you're a Christian, you will do this. And what am I proving? Well, you prove that you've been saved. What? So what am I proving? That I've been made righteous? Oh, so you think salvation is about making me practically righteous. No, salvation is about declaring me positionally righteous perfectly. Practically, I cannot obtain righteousness through law keeping. You say, but the Bible tells us to do this and this. It does. And that's law. And guess what it does? It shows me that I don't. So then what's my hope? Christ, who did it for me. Oh, I know that's going to be considered radical, but it's literally, it comes straight from the Reformation. Do you frustrate the grace of God by thinking or by trying to obtain righteousness through law keeping? Now, I'm not saying we don't try to obey the law. Obviously, we try to pursue the law. We are supposed to. But I don't become righteous by doing it. I'm righteous in Christ. I should try to pursue the law out of gratitude for God's grace, out of a love for God's grace. I should. Now, I don't do it. I don't do it enough. And so then I don't want to frustrate the grace of God by pretending that I am better than I am. I am a mess. I'm a train wreck. I'm a sinner. I started by asking you what frustrates you about the Christian life. But we're ending about how you and I frustrate the grace of God, because that's the real question. It's always easy to think about all the things that frustrate me. Oh, this frustrates me, and this frustrates me, and this frustrates me, and this, 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 and this. But wait a minute, how am I frustrating the grace of God? And I think modern day evangelicalism and fundamentalism is in a perpetual state of frustrating the grace of God, which leads to discouragement, disillusionment, and I think leads to deconstruction. Because you're taught all of this stuff about what's going to happen, and then you realize I'm still a sinner, and I sin over and over and over again. And you know what? So many Christian young people, they just think Christianity is about doing the right thing. They just always think it's about moralism. It's about rules. It's about doing. But you cannot obtain righteousness from law keeping. I'm going to read Galatians 2. I'm going to read Galatians 2:21 from this translation. I do not frustrate the grace of God, for if righteousness comes by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. I think that's two translations making it very clear. And I know people will talk all around us and try to come up with a million ways to explain this away. But I think that I think it's really a fundamental question. Do you believe righteousness is obtained by law keeping? Just walk around I know I say this every week and nobody ever does anything, ever ask, but walk around your church tomorrow and just say, hey, do you become righteous by doing right? Well, absolutely. Amen. You got to do the right thing. Stop doing the wrong thing. No drinking, no drugs, no rock and roll, no dances, no long hair, whatever they're yelling about at any particular time. And I don't do those things. So I'm a good man. No, you're a sinner. You don't realize it. You can't obtain righteousness by doing good. Why? Because God's standard for doing good is perfection, and your good is never good enough to be considered righteousness. That's why you need a foreign righteousness, an alien righteousness, which is not obtained by doing good. It's obtained by faith. Are you frustrating the grace of God? You can email me, newsif@yahoo.com. That's newsif@yahoo.com. That's newsif@yahoo.com. Thank you for allowing me to take my frustration, because I was focused on my situation and being frustrated by my situation. And thank you for letting me process that so that I flip it around. So now I'm more frustrated and how I frustrate the grace of God. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's a bad thing that I do that. I guess it's a good thing that I know I do that. Do you do that? I'd love to hear. Thanks for listening. Everyone have a great Saturday. God bless.